A 90-year-old veteran stands her ground against a group of unruly bikers, but one phone call changes everything. The twist will leave you in awe. Don't miss more stories of courage and resilience. Hit subscribe now. Mildred Washington, a name that carried whispers of history, lived on a quiet street in the heart of Topeka, Kansas. Her home was modest, a small white house with faded shutters, surrounded by a garden she tended daily with loving care. At 90 years old, Mildred had earned the right to a peaceful life, though her past spoke of anything but tranquility. She was a veteran, one of the few black women who had served as a nurse during World War II. Her stories, though rich with history, were rarely shared beyond her close-knit circle of neighbors and friends. Life in this small neighborhood moved at a gentle pace. Mornings began with the sound of children riding bicycles and birds chirping in the maple trees that lined the street. For Mildred, mornings were her sanctuary. She'd sit on her front porch, a steaming cup of tea in hand, watching the world unfold around her. But one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. A deep, guttural roar broke the calm. The sound came from a line of motorcycles rumbling down the street, disrupting the serenity that Mildred cherished. The bikers were young, loud, and dressed in black leather, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet street. They stopped abruptly near her house, parking their bikes on the grass along the sidewalk. Engines sputtered before dying, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter, boisterous, mocking, and intentionally loud enough to reach Mildred's ears. She watched them from her porch, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The leader, a tall man with a red bandana tied around his head, noticed her gaze. He smirked and nudged his companions. "Look at the granny over there. Bet she's got stories about the dinosaurs," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The group erupted in laughter. Mildred didn't flinch. Her dark brown eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied them with quiet resolve. She didn't respond. Instead, she rose slowly from her chair, gripping the armrest for support, and walked inside her house. She closed the door softly behind her. The bikers saw this as an invitation to escalate their antics. Music blared from a speaker one of them had strapped to his bike, a jarring contrast to the peaceful hum of the neighborhood. They hollered and laughed, their voices carrying across the street, disturbing the neighbors who peeked cautiously from behind curtains but dared not intervene. For Mildred, this wasn't just noise. It was a challenge. She had faced much louder and more terrifying adversaries in her lifetime. The memories of war and the prejudice she endured as a black woman in the military had toughened her spirit. She wasn't one to be easily rattled. Later that evening, Mildred stepped onto her porch again, this time carrying a broom. She swept the wooden planks as though the loud music and jeers were nothing more than an annoying breeze. The bikers noticed her again and turned their attention back to her. "Hey, Grandma! Don't hurt yourself with that broom," one of them shouted, earning more laughter from the group. Mildred didn't reply. Instead, she paused her sweeping and looked directly at them. Her steady gaze was unyielding, and for a brief moment the laughter faltered. She returned inside, without a word. But Mildred knew that silence wasn't enough. These men were pushing boundaries, and she could feel the tension growing. She glanced at the old rotary phone in her kitchen, her fingers brushing its cool surface. It had been years since she'd dialed the number she was now considering. As she sat at her table, her eyes fell on a faded photograph hanging on the wall. It was her, standing tall in her army uniform, surrounded by comrades whose loyalty had been forged in the fire of war. She let out a slow, measured breath. Mildred wasn't about to let her quiet life be disrupted by a group of young men who thought their noise could intimidate her. She knew exactly what she needed to do, but the time had to be right. The next day the bikers returned. This time they were louder, brasher, and more obnoxious. Their engines roared as they pulled up in front of Mildred's house again, deliberately revving to create as much disruption as possible. Neighbors peered through their curtains but hesitated to step outside, their unease palpable. This was no ordinary neighborhood disturbance. These men seemed determined to prove they owned the street. Mildred sat on her porch again, her hands resting on her lap. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in front of her. The leader, the one with the red bandana, sauntered over to her picket fence, his boots crunching against the gravel. He leaned against the fence casually, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Hey, Granny," he called out. "Don't you think it's time you moved to a nursing home? This street's too lively for someone like you." The group burst into laughter, clapping each other on the back as if they'd delivered the joke of the year. Mildred didn't respond. She remained seated, her gaze fixed on the leader with a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle him, though he wouldn't admit it. The harassment wasn't just verbal. They began throwing empty beer cans onto her lawn, laughing as they watched her pick them up one by one. She did so without complaint, methodically placing the cans into a trash bag before returning to her seat. But inside, she was calculating. Every insult, every jeer, was catalogued in her mind. These boys had no idea who they were dealing with. By the third day, the bikers' antics had grown even bolder. They set up a makeshift camp on the sidewalk, playing loud music and treating the area as if it were their private playground. Mildred's once pristine lawn was now littered with garbage, and the noise was constant. The leader's taunts grew crueler, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe you don't mind the mess, huh?" he shouted over the music. "Figured an old lady like you wouldn't care. Probably can't even see straight anymore." One of the younger bikers hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Mildred with a trace of discomfort. "Maybe we're going too far," he muttered, but the leader waved him off. "What's she gonna do? Call the cops, please. They won't bother with some harmless fun." But Mildred didn't call the police. She knew better than anyone that some battles required a more strategic approach. She wasn't intimidated. She was waiting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the bikers' laughter echoed down the street, Mildred stepped onto her porch with a determined expression. She held her old rotary phone in one hand and a notebook in the other, its pages filled with names and numbers she hadn't looked at in decades. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She dialed a number she hadn't called in over 40 years. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a voice answered on the other end. "Mildred, is that really you?" The voice was gruff but warm, filled with a mix of surprise and respect. "It's me, Arthur," she replied, her voice steady. "I need a favor." Arthur Washington, her younger brother and a retired Army Ranger, listened intently as she explained the situation. He didn't interrupt, but Mildred could hear the tension in his silence. "Say no more," Arthur said finally. "I'll handle it." Mildred hung up the phone and returned to her chair on the porch, her expression unreadable. The bikers were still laughing, oblivious to the storm brewing just out of sight. By the time they realized what was coming, it would be far too late. The morning air carried the faint scent of rain, but the sky remained stubbornly clear. Mildred stood by her kitchen window, watching the bikers gather once again. Their laughter grated against her nerves, but she didn't let it show. Her face remained calm, her hands steady as she brewed a pot of tea. This was the day everything would change. Arthur had promised her he'd handle it, but Mildred didn't believe in leaving things entirely in someone else's hands. She had spent her life fighting battles, some on the front lines of a war, others against the quiet prejudice that followed her home. This would be no different. As she sipped her tea, she glanced at the photo of her husband, Charles, sitting proudly on the counter. He'd been gone for over 2 decades, but his words still echoed in her mind. "Never let them see you sweat, Mildred, even when they're trying to break you." The sound of a beer can clattering against her porch broke her reverie. She set the cup down and walked to the door. The leader was back, grinning like a fox in a henhouse. "You don't give up, do you?" he sneered. Most people would have begged us to leave by now. Mildred opened the door, but didn't step outside. She looked him straight in the eye, and with the same calm tone she used to soothe soldiers in the field, said, "You should enjoy your fun while it lasts." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the laughter. The leader hesitated, his grin faltering for a split second before he recovered. "You got a sense of humour, Granny. I'll give you that." He turned back to his crew, but the others weren't laughing this time. Mildred closed the door, her heart steady, her mind sharp. She picked up the phone once more, dialing a second number. This one wasn't for Arthur. It was for Martha Jenkins, a former lieutenant in her unit and one of the most resourceful women Mildred had ever known. Martha was retired now, living just a few towns over, but her loyalty was unwavering. "Mildred," Martha said when she picked up, her voice filled with warmth. "It's been too long. What's going on?" Mildred explained everything. Every insult, every piece of trash thrown on her lawn, every laugh. Martha listened quietly, and when Mildred finished, there was a pause. "Well," Martha said, her tone suddenly firm, "you know I'm not one to sit idly by. I've got a few connections who'd love to pay those boys a visit." Mildred allowed herself a small smile. "I knew you'd say that." Later that afternoon, as the bikers continued their racket, Mildred sat on her porch with a sense of quiet anticipation. She noticed the younger biker again, the one who seemed uncomfortable with the group's behavior. He was sitting apart from the others, his gaze lingering on her. For a moment, Mildred considered speaking to him, but she decided against it. His moral compass, however faint, wasn't her responsibility to guide. She had bigger plans. The hours dragged on, the sun setting behind the row of houses, casting long shadows across the street. The bikers showed no signs of leaving, but Mildred wasn't worried. When the first set of headlights appeared at the end of the street, her lips curved into a subtle smile. 2 SUVs rolled in slowly, their engines humming with authority. The bikers didn't notice at first, too caught up in their music and laughter. Mildred sat back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Time to teach these boys a lesson," she murmured to herself. What happened next would turn the tables in ways they never saw coming. The first SUV came to a stop directly across the street from Mildred's house, its engine rumbling to a halt. The second pulled in right behind it. The doors opened in unison, and out stepped 4 men, their movements deliberate and calm, radiating an air of authority. They were older, each wearing black jackets with an insignia stitched onto the chest, a crest that symbolized their time as Army Rangers. Arthur emerged from the driver's seat of the first SUV, his imposing frame and silver-streaked beard giving him a commanding presence. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but his stance alone spoke volumes. Behind him stood 3 of his closest friends from his unit, all retired military, all trained to handle situations exactly like this. The bikers froze mid-laugh, their heads turning toward the newcomers. The leader, still leaning against Mildred's fence, straightened up, his cocky grin faltering as he sized up the men approaching. Arthur's eyes locked onto him, and the weight of his gaze was enough to wipe the smirk off the leader's face entirely. "You must be the one who's been bothering my sister," Arthur said, his voice calm but edged with steel. His words carried a weight that silence seemed to amplify. "Sister?" the leader echoed, glancing nervously at Mildred, who was now watching the scene unfold with a faint smile. "We were just hanging out." Arthur took a step closer, his hands resting casually at his sides, but his presence was anything but casual. "Hanging out," he repeated, his tone flat. "By throwing trash on her lawn, blasting music at all hours, mocking a woman who's done more for this country than you could ever imagine." The leader's crew shifted uneasily, their bravado evaporating under the scrutiny of Arthur and his team. One of the bikers muttered something, but the leader waved him off, trying to maintain a shred of authority. "Look, we didn't mean any harm," the leader said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "It was just some fun." Arthur didn't break eye contact. Let me tell you what fun looks like to me. Fun is respecting people who've earned it. Fun is knowing when to back off before you bite off more than you can chew. The tension in the air was palpable, and the bikers were no longer laughing. The younger biker, the one who had seemed uneasy from the start, took a step back, distancing himself from the group. His eyes darted to Mildred, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. Before the leader could respond, Martha's car pulled up behind the SUVs. She stepped out, dressed sharply in a blazer, her presence every bit as commanding as Arthur's. Following her were two local veterans she had called in, men who had known Mildred for years and weren't about to let her be disrespected. Martha surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes landing on the leader. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," she said coolly. "Do you have any idea who she is, what she's done? She served this country when people like you wouldn't even lift a finger. You think your little antics intimidate her? You're nothing but noise." The leader opened his mouth to argue, but Arthur cut him off with a sharp, "Enough." Arthur gestured toward the bikers' motorcycles. "Pick up your trash, get on your bikes, and leave. If you're smart, you'll think twice before coming back here, or bothering anyone else like this again." For a moment, no one moved. Then, reluctantly, the leader signaled to his crew. They began gathering the trash, their swagger completely gone. Arthur and his team didn't have to raise their voices or throw a single punch. Their sheer presence had been enough. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and prepared to leave, Arthur turned to Mildred and gave her a small nod. She nodded back, her smile widening slightly. Justice had been served. But for Mildred, the lesson wasn't just about reclaiming her peace. It was about teaching the bikers something they'd never forget. As the bikers reluctantly rode off, their engines growling low in defeat, the street finally returned to the peaceful quiet it had once known. The neighbors, who had been peeking from their windows and behind cracked doors, began stepping outside. Slowly, cautiously, they gathered near Mildred's house, murmuring in low voices, their eyes darting between her and the group of veterans who had come to her defense. Mildred remained on her porch, sitting with her hands neatly folded in her lap, her expression calm but resolute. Arthur climbed the steps to join her, taking the empty chair beside her. His presence, as steady as it was protective, gave her a sense of warmth she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the quiet settle like a blanket over the neighborhood. Martha approached, her heels clicking softly against the sidewalk. "They won't be back," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "And if they do, they'll find out what real trouble looks like." Mildred chuckled softly, the sound light but meaningful. "I wasn't too worried," she replied. "I knew you'd come through." Arthur leaned back in his chair, glancing over at the small crowd of neighbors now gathered at the edge of the lawn. "Looks like you've got some explaining to do," he said, a teasing lilt to his voice. Mildred smiled but didn't move to address them. Instead, one of the neighbors, a woman in her 40s named Denise, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ms. Washington," she began, her voice tinged with both awe and apology, "we had no idea about your service, about everything you've done. We should have spoken up sooner, but—" Mildred raised a hand, silencing her gently. "There's no need for apologies," she said, her voice steady. "We all find our strength in different ways. Today just happened to be my turn." Denise nodded, her eyes glistening. The neighbors began to disperse, offering quiet thanks and warm smiles as they passed. Some lingered longer, placing their hands over Mildred's, as if to convey the gratitude they couldn't quite put into words. As the street emptied again, Arthur turned to Mildred, his expression softening. "You know, you didn't have to handle this alone. You could have called sooner." Mildred met his gaze, a faint twinkle in her eye. "And deny you the chance to play the hero? Where's the fun in that?" Arthur laughed, a deep, genuine sound that carried through the evening air. "You haven't changed a bit," he said. "Still stubborn as ever." Mildred's gaze turned to the younger biker who had hesitated earlier. She had noticed him lingering at the edge of the group, his expression conflicted as he watched the others pick up their mess. Now, as the rest of the bikers rode off, he stayed behind, pacing nervously before finally approaching the porch. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice faltering. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I didn't know who you were." Mildred studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's not about who I am," she said gently. "It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are." The young man nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I'll do better," he mumbled before walking back to his bike. As he rode off, Mildred leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. Arthur reached over and patted her hand. "You've always had a way with words," he said. Mildred shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. Sometimes people just need a reminder. But reminders aren't always gentle. Some come with a force that shakes the ground beneath your feet and ensures you never forget. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the street in hues of orange and gold, Mildred allowed herself a moment to reflect. Her quiet home was hers again, the tranquility restored not through violence, but through steadfast resolve and the strength of her connections. Arthur, Martha, and the others had stepped in when she needed them most. Not because she was helpless, but because they understood the importance of standing together. Arthur stayed a while longer, sitting beside her in companionable silence. "You know," he said finally, breaking the stillness, "what you did out there wasn't just about you. Those boys learned a lesson today, not just about respect, but about courage, and where it truly comes from." Mildred nodded slowly. "Courage isn't loud. It's not about who shouts the most or makes the biggest scene. It's about standing firm when others try to shake you. It's about knowing when to act and when to let the silence speak for itself." Arthur smiled. "And you've been teaching that lesson your whole life." As the night deepened, the neighbors who had earlier gathered began returning to their homes, carrying with them a newfound respect for the quiet woman on the corner. Some left flowers at the edge of her fence as a gesture of thanks. Others simply waved, their expressions filled with gratitude. The young biker's words lingered in Mildred's mind. "I'll do better." She hoped he would. It was a reminder that even those who seem hardened can change when given the opportunity. But change requires accountability, and she'd made sure they understood that. Martha stepped up to the porch, her sharp heels clicking softly against the wooden steps. "You've still got it, Mildred," she said with a grin. "I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of you." Mildred chuckled. "You'd think after all these years people would know better than to mess with a veteran." The three of them shared a quiet laugh before Arthur and Martha bid her good night. As their SUVs disappeared down the street, Mildred stayed on the porch a little longer, letting the cool night air wrap around her. She looked up at the stars, thinking of her husband, her comrades, and the life she'd built. Every struggle, every challenge had led her here, to this moment of peace, earned and cherished. Before heading inside, she turned to the small crowd of remaining neighbors. "If there's one thing to take from all this," she said, her voice carrying a quiet power, "it's to stand together. Don't wait for someone else to act. Sometimes courage means being the first to speak." The words hung in the air, a reminder to everyone listening that strength doesn't come from size or power. It comes from conviction and unity. As the door closed behind her, Mildred's house returned to its familiar calm. But the impact of what had happened that week would linger in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and the power of community.